Imagine a ship that vanished into the Mediterranean mist for 2 long years, given up for lost, mourned by families, written off by merchants. Then one morning, it glides back into Dublin harbour like a ghost made flesh, the crew alive, the cargo intact. But their story? Nobody could make sense of it. This is the tale of the Ouzel Galley, a mystery that would haunt Irish maritime history for centuries and birth one of the most unusual organisations in commercial law. A story so strange that even today, historians can't agree on what really happened during those missing 2 years. Dublin in the late 1600s was a city that lived and breathed by the rhythm of the tides. Ships were the arteries of commerce, carrying Irish goods to distant lands and returning with exotic treasures from the Mediterranean, the Levant, and beyond. Every departure was a gamble with fate. Pirates prowled the shipping lanes like wolves. Storms could dash vessels against rocks or swallow them whole. Wars turned merchant ships into prizes for enemy navies. The Ouzel Galley was no different from hundreds of other merchant vessels that called Dublin home. She was sturdy, reliable, crewed by seasoned sailors who knew the Mediterranean routes like the back of their weathered hands. Her captain was experienced, her investors wealthy Dublin merchants who understood the risks, but trusted in the profits that successful voyages could bring. When the Ouzel Galley departed Dublin harbour bound for the Levant, nobody thought twice. It was routine. The ship carried Irish goods destined for markets in the eastern Mediterranean, following routes that had been travelled for generations. The plan was simple: sail south, trade the cargo, purchase exotic goods and return home with profits that would make everyone wealthy. But weeks turned into months, and the Ouzel Galley failed to appear on the horizon. In an age before radio or telegraph, communication was impossible once a ship left port. Families waited, merchants waited, but as seasons changed and other vessels returned with news from Mediterranean ports, a grim reality settled over Dublin. No one had seen the Ouzel Galley. No wreckage had been spotted. She had simply vanished as if swallowed by the sea itself. The merchants who had invested in the voyage faced financial ruin. Families mourned sons and fathers presumed dead. Insurance claims were filed. Cargo was written off as total loss. The Ouzel Galley became another casualty of the dangerous world of 17th century maritime commerce. But the story was far from over. The loss of the Ouzel Galley created a legal nightmare that Dublin's merchants had never encountered before. Who owned the cargo now that the ship was gone? What about the families of the crew? How should insurance claims be handled when nobody could prove what had actually happened to the vessel? The disputes grew so complex and contentious that the Dublin merchant community took an unprecedented step. They established the Ouzel Galley Society, an organization designed specifically to arbitrate maritime disputes and losses. Named after the lost ship that had created the need for such an organization, the society became the final authority on commercial disagreements that the regular courts couldn't handle. For nearly 2 years, the Ouzel Galley Society worked to untangle the legal mess left by the vanished ship. Families received compensation, investors wrote off their losses. Dublin moved on. Then came the morning that changed everything. A lookout scanning Dublin harbour spotted familiar sails on the horizon. As the ship drew closer, disbelief turned to shock, then to chaos. The Ouzel Galley was home. The vessel looked exactly as she had when she departed 2 years earlier. Her hull was weathered but sound. Her sails were patched but functional, and most incredibly, her cargo holds were full. Not just full. They contained the exact goods she had carried when she left Dublin, plus additional merchandise that could only have come from successful trading in Mediterranean markets. But it was the crew that truly defied explanation. Every man who had sailed with the Ouzel Galley 2 years before walked down the gangplank very much alive. They were thinner, darker from Mediterranean sun, but unmistakably the same sailors who had been mourned as dead. The captain stepped onto the dock and was immediately surrounded by officials, merchants and family members demanding answers. Where had they been? What had happened? Why hadn't they sent word? The explanations that followed satisfied no one. The crew told a story of storms that had blown them off course, of damage that required extensive repairs in remote ports, of complications that had delayed their return. But the details were vague, contradictory, and failed to account for the missing time. Some crew members claimed they had been captured by pirates but eventually freed. Others insisted they had simply been delayed by bad weather and mechanical problems. Most puzzling was their cargo. If they had been prisoners or stranded, how had they managed to conduct profitable trade? If they had been delayed by disasters, why was their ship in such good condition? If they had been unable to communicate, why hadn't anyone in any Mediterranean port remembered seeing them? The Dublin merchant community found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. The Uzel Galley Society, which had been created to handle the ship's disappearance, now had to decide what to do about its impossible return. Legally, everything had changed during the ship's absence. Insurance had been paid, cargo had been written off, families had received death benefits, new business partnerships had been formed. The return of the Uzel Galley threatened to unravel 2 years of carefully resolved disputes. More troubling was the question that nobody wanted to voice openly. Had the crew planned their disappearance? Some whispered that the captain and his men had deliberately vanished to conduct private trading ventures, using their cargo as capital to build personal wealth in Mediterranean markets. When their profits were secure, they had returned with a fabricated story of disasters and delays. This theory explained many of the inconsistencies in their story. It accounted for their successful trading despite supposed difficulties. It explained why nobody remembered seeing them in ports where they claimed to have been stranded. It even explained their reluctance to provide detailed accounts of their missing years, but it was a theory that, if proven true, would mean the crew had committed fraud on a massive scale. Others believed the crew's claims of misfortune and bad luck. The Mediterranean was a dangerous place, full of pirates, storms, and political conflicts that could easily explain a 2-year delay. Perhaps the crew had been captured and enslaved, only winning their freedom after years of captivity. Perhaps they had been stranded in remote locations where communication with Ireland was impossible. This theory painted the crew as victims rather than conspirators, men who had suffered tremendously during their absence and deserved sympathy rather than suspicion. A third group suggested something even more intriguing, that the Uzel Galley had stumbled into political or military conflicts that required secrecy. Perhaps they had been pressed into service by naval forces. Perhaps they had become involved in smuggling operations or covert missions that couldn't be revealed even after their return. This theory would explain their vague, inconsistent stories as necessary deception to protect themselves and others from political consequences. The Uzel Galley Society found itself in an impossible position. They had to decide who owned the cargo, who should pay back the insurance money, and whether the crew should face charges for their mysterious absence. But without being able to prove what had actually happened during those missing 2 years, every decision would be based on speculation and suspicion rather than facts. The Society's ruling was as diplomatic as it was unsatisfying. They acknowledged that the crew's story contained inconsistencies but couldn't prove deliberate fraud. They ordered that insurance payments be returned, but allowed the crew to keep profits from any legitimate trading they had conducted. Most importantly, they established new procedures for handling similar cases in the future, creating legal frameworks that would govern maritime commerce for generations. The mystery of the Uzel Galley became legendary in Dublin and throughout Ireland. The story was told and retold, with each generation adding new theories and speculation about what had really happened during those missing years. Some storytellers painted the crew as clever rogues who had pulled off the greatest commercial heist in Irish history. Others portrayed them as tragic heroes who had survived incredible hardships to return home against impossible odds. Still others suggested supernatural explanations, claiming the ship had sailed into some kind of temporal anomaly or otherworldly realm. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the Uzel Galley was the organization created in its honor. The Uzel Galley Society continued to operate for centuries after the ship's mysterious return, becoming one of Dublin's most respected arbitration bodies. Long after the original mystery had faded into legend, the Society continued to resolve commercial disputes with wisdom and fairness that earned international recognition. The irony was perfect. A ship whose disappearance and return created chaos and confusion had given birth to an organization that brought order and justice to maritime commerce. Historians today remain divided about what really happened to the Uzel Galley during those missing 2 years. Modern analysis of shipping records, weather patterns, and political conflicts of the era has failed to provide definitive answers. Every theory has supporting evidence and glaring weaknesses. What we do know is that the Uzel Gali case changed how maritime law dealt with disappearances, insurance claims, and commercial disputes. The precedents established by the Uzel Gali Society influenced legal systems far beyond Ireland, creating frameworks that protected both merchants and crew members in an inherently dangerous industry. The ship itself eventually returned to routine service, carrying cargo between Dublin and Mediterranean ports until it was finally retired years later. But its reputation for mystery followed it everywhere. Sailors would point to the Uzel Gali in harbors and whisper stories about the vessel that had cheated death and defied explanation. The truth about those missing 2 years died with the crew members who lived through them. Whatever really happened during their absence, they took the secret to their graves, leaving behind only questions that have puzzled historians for centuries. Were they victims of extraordinary circumstances beyond their control? Were they clever conspirators who executed a brilliant fraud? Were they caught up in political intrigue that required lifelong secrecy? Or did something even stranger happen to them during those missing years, something so unusual that no believable explanation existed? The beauty of the Uzel Gali mystery is that every theory remains possible. In an age before modern communication and detailed record-keeping, ships could indeed vanish for years and return with stories that couldn't be verified. Pirates, storms, mechanical failures, political conflicts, and simple bad luck were all constant threats that could easily explain a prolonged absence. But the inconsistencies in the crew's story, the perfect condition of their cargo, and the suspicious timing of their return suggest that human agency rather than natural disaster might have been responsible for their disappearance. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the extremes. Maybe the crew did encounter genuine difficulties that delayed their return, but also took advantage of their situation to conduct profitable private trading. Maybe they were captured by pirates, but managed to negotiate their freedom by sharing trading profits. Maybe they were pressed into military service but found ways to continue their commercial activities. Or maybe their story was exactly what they claimed, a series of unfortunate events that kept them away from home far longer than anyone had expected, with the inconsistencies in their accounts resulting from trauma, fading memories, and the natural human tendency to adjust stories over time. The Uzel Gali mystery endures because it captures something fundamental about human nature and the age of sail. It was an era when anything seemed possible, when ships could disappear into the vast ocean and return with tales of adventure, disaster, and wonder. It was a time when the line between legitimate commerce and outright piracy was often blurry, when survival required quick thinking and moral flexibility. Most importantly, it was an age when mysteries could remain mysterious, when some questions would never be answered, no matter how much people wanted to know the truth. The Uzel Gali represents all of this: the romance and danger of maritime adventure, the complex moral landscape of commercial enterprise, and the eternal human fascination with unexplained disappearances and impossible returns. Today, when satellites track every vessel and communication systems keep ships in constant contact with shore, it's difficult to imagine how a merchant vessel could simply vanish for 2 years. But in the 17th century, such disappearances were tragically common, and the return of a lost ship would have seemed like a miracle regardless of the circumstances involved. The Uzel Gali gave Dublin more than just a mystery to puzzle over. It gave the city an institution that would serve the maritime community for generations, establishing principles of fairness and arbitration that influenced commercial law throughout the British Isles and beyond. In the end, perhaps the crew's greatest achievement wasn't surviving their mysterious 2-year absence or returning with their cargo intact. Perhaps it was inspiring the creation of an organization that would prevent future maritime disputes from causing the kind of chaos and confusion their return had created. The Uzel Gali Society became a model for commercial arbitration that protected merchants, crew members, and their families from the legal uncertainties that had always plagued maritime trade. By turning mystery into justice and confusion into order, The legacy of the Uzel galley proved more valuable than any cargo the ship had ever carried. What do you think really happened to the Uzel galley during those missing 2 years? Were they victims of circumstances beyond their control, clever conspirators executing a brilliant scheme, or something else entirely? The evidence supports multiple theories, and the truth may be lost to history forever. But maybe that's exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are more valuable unsolved than they would be with definitive answers. The Uzel galley mystery continues to inspire imagination, debate, and wonder, more than 3 centuries after that impossible morning when a dead ship sailed back into Dublin Harbour with the living crew and a story that nobody could quite believe. In our modern world of GPS tracking and satellite communication, we've lost the possibility of such mysteries. Ships no longer vanish into the unknown, only to return years later with tales that defy explanation. Perhaps that makes us safer, but it also makes us a little less capable of wonder. The Uzel galley reminds us that there was once a time when the world still held secrets, when ships could disappear into the vast blue mystery of the ocean and return transformed by experiences that couldn't be fully explained or understood. It was a more dangerous time, but also a more magical one, when reality itself seemed more flexible and stories like the Uzel galley could actually happen. And maybe, just maybe, they're still happening somewhere out there, beyond the reach of our satellites and tracking systems, in the deep waters where mystery and wonder still survive.